Our talk tonight will continue our theme of New York City wetland ecology as we hear more about the work of the Bronx River Alliance to monitor and restore the unique ecosystem that is the city's only freshwater river. And so to talk about this, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Christian Murphy. Christian is the ecology coordinator for the Bronx River Alliance after working first with them as a seasonal conservation crew member. He manages the collection and processing of water quality data and organizes volunteers who participate in stewardship along the Bronx River. He also helped design and lead the first successful microplastic pilot study on the Bronx River. Christian earned a bachelor's from CUNY Hunter College in environmental studies and earth science, and spent a season in Western Colorado performing ecological research for the US Bureau of Land Management on rare and endangered species. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Christian.
Thanks, Lydia. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I would just like to go over a little bit about the work that I do and the work that the Bronx River Alliance does to protect and restore the Bronx River and ways that folks like you have been able to get involved and what our plans are for the future of restoring the Bronx River. So this is a quick shot from the West Farms Rapids section of the Bronx River. This is just below the 2 and 5 trains as they approach East 180th Street. This is an area in particular that has been restored quite heavily. That looked quite different, and you'll see a picture from the 1940s that really exemplifies this. So, but first and foremost, if you're not familiar with the Bronx River, this is New York City's only freshwater river. It runs for 25 miles, starting from the Kensico Dam, and extends all the way down to Soundview Park. Technically, the river actually begins between the towns of Armonk and Chappaqua, and then a couple other municipalities up north. But conventionally, basically, the river starts at the base of the Kensico Dam. And so it's a pretty unique habitat. It is freshwater for most of its course, but the lower 3 miles are tidal. And so the estuary, we like to say, is a nursery. We find a lot of species that have their babies there, including Atlantic Manhattan, some bird species as well. They do migrate to the area and they use the wonderful resources that the river provides. And so just really quickly, you can see some of the differences between the upper and lower portions of the river. This picture on the top was taken in Valhalla, New York. You can see that it's quite heavily forested. And here at the bottom, this is actually where I'm sitting right now, inside the office building. In Starlight Park, this is Bronx River House. We consider this the cleanest and greenest building in the Bronx. It features a lot of green energy solutions like solar panels, a rainwater harvesting system, and geothermal. So the idea is that we are trying to demonstrate how we can protect New York City as a whole in the future by showing what we can do for this area of the Bronx right now. So to give you a quick history of the Bronx River, it was called Aquahung by the Lenni Lenape indigenous groups that lived here. Aquahung loosely translating most likely to River of High Bluffs, and this sort of gives you a clue as to the sort of geography of the region. There are a lot of steep gorges and high cliff faces, and they would have noticed that back in the day as they traveled up and down the river. The river was pristine. Actually, when the colonists arrived in the area, they found that the water was so pure that they considered to supply 90% of New York City's drinking water with water from the Bronx River. It used to run so thickly with fish migrating north that the inhabitants of this watercourse said that the water ran silver in the spring because the fish were so abundant that they reflected so much sunlight that the river actually looked like it was made of silver. Of course, when the colonists found that the river could be used to power the Industrial Revolution in the area, a lot of things changed. Rather than seeing the river as a beautiful natural resource and appreciating the rich biodiversity that it supported, the river was seen as a tool. It was seen as a means to transport materials, as a means to power mills and dams and textile manufacturing and things like that. And unfortunately, what we ended up doing was destroying the river. Factories, foundries, different kinds of locations appeared on the river, and what people did was dump their pollutants into the water, basically with the mindset that once these are carried away downstream, they're gone. Out of sight, out of mind, the water is taking care of the issue. And as we now know in this day and age, that is simply not true. Most of these toxic substances stepped into the bottom. They were deposited in the sediments. A lot of them are still there now. And they destroyed the riverbanks. And so a lot of the native plant life and habitat that lived along the banks of the river was killed. Either it was poisoned or it was cleared out to make way for this new urban landscape. And so what was once the most beautiful river in New York City and in the sort of lower Hudson region, if you ask me, really became what was called an open sewer. It was foul, it was toxic, it was a blight on the landscape. And it's really when people began to try to forget the river existed. And even to this day, if you ask residents in the central Bronx if they've heard of or seen the Bronx River, many people will tell you they have never heard of it, they don't know where it is, they don't know what it looks like, and they could be living a couple streets away from it. So this mindset really took in around this time, the 1930s and 40s, when these pictures were taken. And eventually it got to the point where the local residents were so fed up with this embarrassment in their backyards that they decided they had enough. They actually banded together and volunteered to clean out the Bronx River. And by that point, it was actually full of industrial waste in addition to a lot of the other chemical pollutants. So some of the first things that were done was like the cars, the industrial machinery, home appliances, they were actually removed by hand by these volunteers. And so dedicated were they to this cause that these volunteers actually got the attention of the Army Corps of Engineers, the New York City Parks Department, and other major entities who were able to get them better equipment, better teams of people to make the work move more efficiently. And so, these volunteers were really intrepid. They were quite a family, really, and they were solidified in 2001 as the Bronx River Alliance, a 501c3 nonprofit that aims to protect and restore the Bronx River so that it could be a healthy ecological, educational, recreational, and economic resource for the communities through which the river flows. And some of the same tenets of these original volunteers we still hold today, namely ecology, restoration, education, and making sure that these communities can access the river for recreation, for health and wellness, and so on and so forth. So, of course, as much progress and incredible things that these people have accomplished over the years, we're still dealing with some pretty major issues on the Bronx River. And the most obvious one visually is floatable waste. And so these two pictures were actually taken mid-river in the Bronx Zoo and actually in Shoelace Park, just north of Bronx Park, near Gun Hill Road. And so when trees come down, or if anything obstructs the flow of water for more than a couple of weeks, this is what you get. No matter what season of the year, no matter what weather we've been having, no matter how often people are using parks along the river, we get inundated by floatable trash. And as horrible as it looks, the impact on the ecosystem is even worse, more than we can imagine. I've personally seen animals suffering from this pollution. The picture on the left was taken within the Bronx Zoo during a public event with the press. They observed this duck with a plastic ring from a bottle around its bill, and so it was unable to open its mouth to eat. And without the intervention of the Bronx Zoo, it would have starved to death, but thankfully, wildlife handlers were alerted, and they actually did manage to catch the duck and free it from this predicament. The image of this seagull I took in the Bronx River estuary while collecting water quality data, and it was anchored to the surface of the water by a plastic bag that was full of water, and it would have obviously died had my coworker and I not been able to step in and free it from this bag. Seeing firsthand how horrible this pollution is, and we have programming dedicated to trying to understand more about where it's coming from so that we can find ways to stop it. So first and foremost, we have to deal with a really lousy assumption about the Bronx River, and it actually pertained to the residents of the Bronx. And this age-old assumption was the Bronx River was dirty because the people of the Bronx are dirty. And the reason why we have so much trash in the water is because these residents don't care enough to take care of the environment. They don't care enough to dispose of their waste properly. They're the ones who are ruining the landscape. And this is an age-old thing that we hear in, lower income and majority people of color communities all over the country, right? But we just didn't think that that really applied here. As much as people like to disrespect the Bronx, we really just didn't think that's why the river was so inundated by trash. And so in 2016, we decided to test it out. There was an oil spill, and we received a settlement from that spill. And with that money, we were able to purchase a trash boom. So the most logical place for us to set it up was on the border between the Westchester and the Bronx. And so anything caught in that boom, we would know was actually coming from upstream in the communities of Westchester and not coming from the residents of the Bronx. Previously, there had only been information from a city-owned boom down at Concrete Plant Park, which is in the estuary, and that was maintained by the city, and that obviously catches everything from the 21 miles of river that stretches above it. And so it wasn't really possible to discern the origins of that material. And more to the point, the city doesn't really quantify what it is that they're removing from that boom. They just kind of take a volumetric analysis. And so that includes things like tree branches and tree trunks, which we don't really consider waste. It's just natural debris. But what we're able to do at our boom, this one at Muskrat Cove Park at the border, is actually look at what is really floating in the water. So this program is called Project Waste. Waste stands for Waterway and Street Trash Elimination, and it is a volunteer-led effort. It's extremely popular. These pictures are actually from Earth Day 2021, from this year. We had about 33 people show up. It was a little bit chilly, but they were really excited to be there. They put on waders, they got into the water, and they got to work cleaning out this trash boom. And so all of the trash that you see caught by this boom does originate in Westchester County, not coming from the Bronx. The way that we quantify this is with this really in-depth data sheet. And so everything that is removed from the water surface as it's put into a trash bag, it's tallied. And so a member of staff will stand nearby with these data sheets, and people will call out, for example, 10 cigarette butts or 15, styrofoam packing peanuts or 5 cans of soda. And so all of this data is recorded, and over the years, we've amassed this very rich data set with really in-depth analysis of the different types of materials that are found in the river. And this is really interesting because we are able to challenge some assumptions about what trash is most prevalent in the water and where it actually comes from. So as you can see from this pie chart on the right, most of the waste found in the water is actually styrofoam. Kind of hard to believe, and it really is not an intuitive sort of result because we don't really see styrofoam all over the environment now. We don't walk down the street and see mounds of styrofoam. At least I don't, and most of the people I speak to don't. But it's what we find in the river. And this is followed sort of a distant second by plastic bottles and then other plastic items, and then in smaller and smaller increments by other waste like cigarette butts and single-use food items and whatnot. We consider this project a huge success. To date, we've engaged more than 3,600 participants from elementary school students all the way up to, anybody else, retirees, corporations who are looking to get their employees volunteer hours doing green work. And it's been wonderful to engage so many different people in this work to restore the river. And the wonderful thing is that as we're collecting the data, we're also literally getting the trash out of the water. And so it's twofold, right? The benefit is twofold. And so we've removed more than 7.5 tons of floatable trash from the Bronx River. And it's really, it is amazing how much waste the river can hold and how much of a burden we put on this really delicate ecosystem. If we look at this spatial analysis, unfortunately, I don't have data ready from 2021, and we didn't collect any data in 2020 because of the pandemic. We actually got a lot of questions about, did the pandemic, change the amount of trash coming in? Did it change the type of trash coming in? And we simply don't know, unfortunately. Word of mouth is that initially there was a reduction in the amount of trash, and then we started to see, or people started to see numbers that looked more sort of typical of a normal year. And I would attribute that to people who had been laid off or been furloughed, spending time outside, in our local parks. And so it wasn't really that the quarantine had put a damper on the amount of litter in the local environment, which was an assumption that had been made. But this spatial analysis looks at a number of trash hotspots along the river in addition to this trash boom data. And so not only are we collecting data from the trash boom, but New York City parks and the Bronx Zoo as well are also collecting trash and counting it at different locations where trash builds up further downstream. And so we can look at the 8 miles of river that runs through the Bronx and see what this composition looks like. I know that these pie charts are a little bit hard to see on the screen, but I think the biggest takeaway is that if you look at the colors of what each wedge symbolizes, you can see that styrofoam does dominate the upper river, and then that sort of changes to plastic as you move downstream. And so the styrofoam really by and large is not coming from the Bronx. It is coming from Westchester County. You can see, some of these numbers are kind of staggering. In the first year alone, 65,102 pieces of trash were collected over 18 trash cleanup events in 2016. And then in 2019, we only had 5 events during the whole year at the trash boom, but we still managed to collect 22,922 items. And if you do that math, it's actually an increase in trash items per cleanup event. And as you can see, it is mostly styrofoam. And so that begs the question of where is this material coming from? And what can we do to get rid of it? We further sort of explored this assumption that the trash was maybe not coming from the street by doing analysis of street trash. Because we didn't quite know, just because we're not seeing styrofoam on the street doesn't mean that it's not actually being deposited on our sidewalks. And maybe it's getting washed down the drains very quickly before it can be seen. But we did this analysis. We looked at the streets adjacent to our trash boom, as well as the 2 trash booms that were installed at the end of 2018 and then 2019 in Westchester County. So there's one in White Plains and there's another one in Tuckahoe. And so this breaks up the river into a couple of reaches. And we did analysis of the street's trash adjacent to these trash booms and found that none of the trash booms are really sort of representing the trash that we find on sidewalks. They all look very different. And even though the trash booms look different from one another, they have some similarities that just don't match with the sidewalk trash. And so this is pretty confusing for a couple of reasons. And one is that in Westchester County, they utilize the municipal separate storm sewer system, or the MS4 system. And so this means that the storm drains that are on the streets lead directly to the river. And so if you pour water down a storm drain in Westchester, it flows directly into one of the water bodies in the Bronx River watershed. That's the Bronx River. And so we know that there are catchment devices to try to prevent some trash from entering the water, but we also know that a lot of those catchment devices are ineffective. Some of them are missing entirely. We know that from speaking with municipal officials in Westchester about why a lot of this infrastructure is missing. And so that's actually an issue that they're working on. But it still is confusing that this trash is not originating from our sidewalks. And so we have some assumptions about what's going on there. And our future sort of investigations will be to see if there are industrial sources that are not properly containing their waste. And so maybe there's a municipal waste facility in one of these towns, or a couple of the towns, and they just not are properly, securing their containers. And so the wind can pick it up and blow it out. It's also possible that there's a density issue. And so certain items may float differently or may be transported over land differently. That could explain why there's this discrepancy. But there's these new lines of investigation that, after collecting this data for a number of years, it is time to sort of adapt and evolve this program to be more investigative. And so that's kind of an exciting avenue that we're going to be pursuing in the next couple of years. The pandemic really sort of did put a damper on this work. It really sort of quenched a lot of the initial enthusiasm that existed in 2019 moving into 2020. There was more sort of investigative analyses that were planned, and hopefully they'll pick up again in 2022. Changing courses just slightly, I did help design a microplastic pilot study which we lump under project waste because it is a form of floatable trash. You know, we assume that as the trash enters the river and stays there for a while, it will break down into microplastics. And so we really do consider it under the umbrella of project waste. And we did a couple trawls with a plankton net, as well as partner with New Jersey Baykeeper and New Jersey City University, who did tissue sample analyses from mussels and oysters in the harbor. And we found a lot of plastic, both in the upper river and in the harbor. In the upper river, we found a lot of fibers, found a lot of pieces of film. The fibers could come from synthetic clothing items. If you're wearing synthetic clothing right now, like I am, that will shed fibers, and that does contribute microplastic to the environment. Plastic bags that are in the water will break down into film, and so on and so forth. And so we found a lot of that in the upper river, in addition to the estuary. And all the tissue samples from the mussels contained plastics, and so we know that these filter-feeding animals are also consuming plastics as well. The most concerning aspect of this study was that when they looked at the ratio of microplastic floating in the water column to plankton, the microplastic actually outnumbered the plankton particles. And so this is pretty significant considering the amount of filter-feeding fish species that we have in the Bronx River, which includes the Atlantic menhaden and the river herring that we are trying to restock and restore. They spend most of their days with their mouths wide open, swimming around, eating anything that floats into them. And so if that happens to be mostly plastic, you can imagine that these are probably not very healthy fish. And if our osprey and other birds are coming in and eating these fish, well, you can imagine that there's this, you know, passage of this pollution up trophic levels of the ecosystem, which is really, you know, a big concern. And of course, that has implications for us as well, because we all know that whatever happens to our ecosystems does eventually impact human beings. So another new avenue of exploration, we're going to try to work microplastics into our regular programming here at the Bronx River Alliance. Now that we have moved into this new facility at River House, we do have the capacity to host students in our classroom or host interested volunteers to look at microplastics, to maybe collect their own samples from nearby water sources and analyze them with our microscopes. I think it's a really engaging way to get the community more aware about this threat and to sort of expose people to the ways of scientific exploration and make that fun as well as informational and educational. We are also hoping to leverage this data to communicate to our elected officials. And so we were obviously big supporters of the styrofoam bans and the plastic bag bans that went into effect in New York City and Westchester County. As you can imagine, these bans have had sort of, well, we'll just say, I still see plastic bags being distributed. I still see styrofoam being distributed at different businesses. And so I'm not really sure how this enforcement is working out. And so we have the data as well as you know, testimonials to suggest that our elected officials could do more to protect the environment and to protect the Bronx River. And we really are planning on ramping up our outreach to our elected officials, both at the Bronx Borough President's Office as well as to municipal officials in Westchester County. And of course, if anyone is interested in joining a letter writing campaign, you know, we would be more than happy to add signatures to something or, you know, rally support for different movements as they pertain to protecting our environment from this pollution. This is very aspirational, but one thing that we would really love to install on the Bronx River is a trash wheel. So this is Mr. Trash Wheel. He lives in Baltimore Harbor. He is a solar-powered, self-sustaining trash monster, the good kind. He actually eats trash via a conveyor belt that is powered by his solar panels. And I believe Mr. Trash Wheel has a camera on the inside, and so you can see actually what's going up the conveyor belt. It's not quite as fine-tuned as really counting the data the way that we do. And I will say that Lydia has been a wonderful volunteer when it comes to project-based. She knows firsthand how interesting it is to actually pick through each piece of trash and count it and look at it. But it would be wonderful to get Mr. Trash Wheel down in the estuary of the Bronx River. And this is sort of the last barrier between the Bronx River and the open ocean. Earlier studies in the mid-aughts found that at any given point in time, up to 165 million pieces of plastic are floating around New York City's waterways. and upwards of 80% of that could originate in the Bronx River. So really, there are some pretty serious implications for stopping this trash from entering the wider marine ecosystem. I'm going to switch courses now to talk about a different form of pollution that we also deal with on the Bronx River, and that is sewage pollution. This is HP 626. This is a municipal separate storm sewer system pipe near the border between the Bronx and Westchester County in Yonkers. The way that these pipes are designed to work is that when it rains, they direct stormwater from streets into water bodies like the Bronx River. And what that means, obviously, is that when it's not raining, these pipes should be dry. This picture was taken on a sunny day, a really beautiful warm day where it hadn't rained for a little while. It was flowing with water, and these little particles that you see on the right are pieces of toilet paper. And I only know that is because larger intact pieces did float by. And so I do know that this really is raw sewage waste that is entering the Bronx River during a sunny day. And so that's quite confusing. And this is not a one-off. This is not the only pipe along the river that does this. Quite a few of them do, going up into the upper watershed. Here's just a quick little schematic infographic about the differences between the MS4 system and the CSO system. CSO stands for Combined Sewer Outfall. This is what we have over most of New York City. Theoretically, this should be the better system because our storm drains, as well as our homes and businesses, are connected to the same pipes, and they all flow to wastewater treatment plants. So that means if you happen to spill something like gasoline on the sidewalk, during normal conditions, that will go to the wastewater treatment plant. That will not flow into a water body. This system should be a better level of protection against our waterways. Unfortunately, the designers of the system in New York City never envisioned 8.5 million people living here. And so the system is not designed to withstand 8.5 million people's worth of water waste. And so during rainstorms, the entire system backs up. As little as 1/10 of an inch of rain actually can trigger this over certain parts of the city. And so it is designed to just relieve pressure by draining into our waterways anyway. And so both of these systems do pollute our waterways. And we would expect that the CSO system would do more pollution because we get a lot of rain in New York City. We would imagine that no sewage would ever enter the river in an MS4 system because those pipes are not connected. They're actually separate. And so what do we find? Here's a quick map of some outfalls in the Bronx. Again, this is just sort of laying out where our CSO outfalls are versus our MS4 outfalls. A couple MS4s in the Bronx, and then up to maybe 100 going up into Westchester County. If you ever walk along a riverside park in New York City and you see one of these green signs, it's telling you there's a CSO nearby. So if you happen to be a person who likes to fish, or if you happen to be a person who likes to paddle in rivers, maybe not the place to do it. And of course, that doesn't stop members of our own community from doing that. And we do try to be mindful about people's lived experiences and where they're coming from, but also try to educate the public on these health risks. Encourage people, if they are catching fish, to catch and release, not to catch and consume. So here's our process. We test specifically for Enterococcus bacteria. Enterococcus is a bacteria that lives inside the intestines of warm-blooded animals. So that includes mammals, it includes birds, it does not include things like fish. So what that means is what we're looking for is poop in the water, really. So this is a volunteer on the left. She is catching a water sample, and then this sample is fed a sort of nutrient that the bacteria consume. As they consume the food, they begin to glow. And so if there is no glow from the sample as it's being processed, there's no bacteria present. If there's a lot of glowing present, there's a lot of bacteria present. And so here's just some images of some pretty dirty samples. The one on the right is pretty well inundated by sewage. Almost every cell in this analysis tray is glowing. And so that translates to many thousands of bacteria cells per 100 milliliters of water. And we find that this is a really, really chronic issue. This is a spatial spread from the top of the watershed down to the bottom. And what we find is this MS4 system in Westchester County is contributing most of the raw sewage pollution to the Bronx River, despite the fact that those pipes are supposed to be separated. The interesting thing about this program is that, again, much like Project Waste, it is volunteer-led. And so to increase our capacity at the Bronx River Alliance, as well as to give people scientific field experience, and also increase awareness of the issue, volunteers collect these water samples and bring them back to us so that we can process them in-house. It's a great way for people to see the watershed. It's a great way for people to, spend time outside. We do this from May to October, so often the weather is really beautiful, and the riparian parkland along the Bronx River is really, really beautiful, and the wildlife is really nice. And so it's enjoyable to do this program, but it can be quite upsetting to see the results. And so we do see spikes in Westchester, particularly White Plains is spiking this year much more than it has in recent years. And the Sprain Brook, which is a brook that runs through Yonkers, has also seen some spikes that are higher than in recent years. So this means that the problem is getting worse. There's a spike down in the Bronx. There's always a spike at the HP009 outfall in Hunts Point. There's nothing that we can really do about that. That's one of our CSO outfalls. It's part of the city's infrastructure. That's not going to be tackled anytime soon. The strange thing is why these spikes exist in Westchester County. If we separate out the days of sampling where it was raining versus the days that it was dry weather, we see that wet weather obviously contributes more to the sewage pollution, which is interesting. This is what we'd expect to see in New York City. That's what we're seeing in Westchester County. So this is further evidence of unusual activity. Part of the potential causes of this are illicit hookups or illegal hookups. And so we do know of at least one documented case where a apartment building owner had hooked up his sewer drain to the storm drain. Somehow this reduces his maintenance costs. It makes it cheaper for him, and so it's a way of cutting a corner. I don't exactly know how that works out, but if it works for him, it definitely works for others. And it's really difficult to monitor. It's very hard to pinpoint who exactly is doing this illegal hooking up of sewer systems to the Bronx River. But as we see these spikes increasing, we know sort of where to focus in our efforts to do a sort of deeper dive and start digging more into the specific outfalls in each area. Just to sort of reinforce our data, if it wasn't already convincing enough, this is the statistical analyses of Enterococcus versus rainfall. And I know this is really unpleasant to look at. Most people don't like math and graphing, but just really quick crash course. The R number is the correlation coefficient. And so this basically demonstrates how well correlated rainfall is with seeing elevated levels of bacteria. The higher the R number, the higher that correlation. In the Bronx, at that CSO outfall in the South Bronx, it's quite low. And in Westchester County, it's relatively high. So this just serves to reinforce this conundrum between these two sewer systems. So what are our future plans? Now that I've dumped all of this information and exposed the problem, what are we going to do about it? This program has been running since 2017, and at this point, much like Project Waste, we also have a pretty robust data set. What we can do is start to zero in on these outfalls. And so what the Bronx River Alliance is planning to do in 2022 is begin to monitor additional analytes. And so in addition to Enterococcus bacteria, we're also going to be monitoring for detergents, right? And we're going to be looking for things that you might find from someone's washing machine or from someone's dishwasher. This is going to help us to zero in on the actual locations of the bacteria. Because as I mentioned before, all living warm-blooded creatures contain Enterococcus. And so just because we're finding it doesn't necessarily mean that it's human in origin. It could come from geese. It could come from dogs. It could come from pet waste, being left on the street instead of being cleaned up by irresponsible dog walkers. And so zeroing in on different forms of the pollution, like soap, bleach, detergents, will help us to be pretty confident when we find outfalls that are emitting this, that it's human in origin and it's municipal in origin. We have the list of outfalls. We have the list of, or the map of where these bacteria are spiking, and those are going to be our places to zero in this targeted outfall study. And this data will go straight to municipal officials. So we've had positive results in Yonkers in the past when reaching out about this kind of issue. And so that gives us optimism that other county officials will be receptive to our data and to our pleas to direct some attention and some funds to maintaining the infrastructure and repairing issues, and also, doling out penalties and punishments when they find entities who are illegally hooking up sewer lines to the river. So that's sort of our work in a nutshell. Obviously, there's plenty of opportunity for the community to get involved with this work, either by joining us for trash cleanup events or by volunteering to collect water samples as part of our sewer research. And if that's something you're interested in, or if you would just like to continue to monitor this with us and stay abreast of our data, you can certainly email me at christian.murphy@bronxriver.org. I'm always happy to chat with people. I'm always happy to send the data if you'd like to look at it. And of course, you can learn more at www.bronxriver.org, or you can find ways to participate in all of our programming, which includes litter sweeps of our parks, invasive species removals, and native tree planting, which is a really popular one, especially in the spring and summer. Volunteers really love to get out there and plant beautiful native trees and flowering plants in our parks. So yeah, thank you very much.
That was really interesting to me because, as you mentioned, I have done a couple of the project waste cleanups. So it's really interesting to see kind of how that, the broader scale of that project and all the kinds of sources and ways that, that trash is getting into the river. It's funny because one of the first questions or comments that someone had was if you guys have ever thought about getting a trash wheel. Lo and behold, yes. But of course, then the thing with that trash wheel is we're not getting that kind of tally about what kind of trash, is getting taken up unless you go through it afterwards. There's also some discussion in here about the status of styrofoam in New York City. If you have any kind of comments about the regulations about styrofoam in New York City and in, north from here and how that's maybe affected or not affected stuff.
Yeah, so I know that there was a grace period for businesses to make that transition from styrofoam to more environmentally friendly materials. And that grace period overlapped with the start of the pandemic. And so it kind of extended through 2020. I'm not quite sure right now at this point where we are with this ban. And Westchester lagged New York City in enforcing this. And so it's possible that a lot of this is residual food waste, right? So it's coming from people using takeout containers. And that's kind of hard to pinpoint. But what we do find is that a lot of the styrofoam appears to be compressed. So when you purchase like a flat screen television, for example, it's usually inside a styrofoam packing unit. And that's kind of what we're finding breaking down. And so the styrofoam ban is not going to impact that kind of product. That would take something much higher up, at least at the state level, probably at the federal level, really, because of where these things originate and how they get shipped across the country. And so it really goes to show how challenging this work is. But I will just say, on our local level, that the pandemic and this grace period kind of nullified the effect of the styrofoam ban for the time being. We're really interested in seeing now in 2022 if these effects are going to be noticed.
I guess that's always the thing, is the enforcement part of it, using the stuff, and if there's no consequence, it's kind of like, yeah. Because same thing with the plastic bags. It looks like Ira, if you have a question, you can go ahead and ask.
My question is, Christian, that was a wonderful presentation. And do you have any photos, or can you make any of those photos that you showed public to us, so that, like, if I wanted to tweet a picture, because yes, I see the issue of, the large pieces of styrofoam coming down from Westchester. And the only way people are going to be sensitized to that, they see pictures of how disgusting it is. I mean, I could write a letter to Kathy Hochul right now, but without a photo, she won't know what the hell I'm talking about. And it's, just Ira Gershenhorn saying something doesn't mean squat. But if there's some sort of a tweet followed, a large tweet storm hitting her or something.
Yes, yeah, I can definitely email photos right now if you email me, but we can also look at ways to share them on our website.
Yeah.
Or share them to our social media to make it easier to share that for you. Yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned in the beginning about how a lot of people haven't even seen the river or, really know about the river, even if it's kind of in their community. It's then if you haven't seen it, you haven't seen what state it's in some places. I know when I first saw the trash boom, I was impressed, not in a good way, with kind of how much stuff there was in it, and that if that wasn't there, it would all be kind of, have floated down. Oh, I did have another question too about the water quality monitoring. So how does that process work when if the volunteers are collecting samples? Do they just mail them, or how does that work?
Yeah, so usually our volunteers actually hand deliver them to us at our office location. Our upper river volunteers tend to have cars because people who live in Westchester usually have cars. Our volunteers in the Bronx often travel by the subway. I actually had one who biked to his sites and bring them to me. It is a challenging program. We're aware of the limitations and the potential inaccessibility of this program to residents of the Bronx or New York City, just because it is hard to get around. And the river is in a lot of, not remote locations, but sort of challenging locations to access via public transit. The samples need to be processed basically immediately. There's a 5-hour window between when they're taken out of the river and when I need to be handling them in the lab for them to be effective. Otherwise, they have to be rejected. So it's tight, and I recognize that that's a little bit prohibitive.
Here we have a question here too about from Ken. In addition to collecting trash, pollutants, and water testing, are there any ongoing studies on the wildlife, such as fishes, amphibians, or macroinvertebrates, and such as the different indicator species of different kind of levels of water quality?
Yes, good question. The only thing I love to talk about more than trash is our indicator species. Yeah, I'll start with the large. We restock alewife herring in the Bronx Zoo. So it was paused during the pandemic, but usually in a typical year, we get a truckload of about 400 fish, often from Bride Brook in Connecticut, but most recently from, I don't remember the river in Long Island. And we actually restock these fish. They are able to access the upper river via the 182nd Street Dam fish passage. So the lowermost dam on the Bronx River has this basically water slide that the fish are able to swim up, and it has a camera inside of it. So we can actually see what fish are using them, how often, and what, how many of each type. The alewife seem to be using it the least, unfortunately, although they are our target species. We have sunfish, suckers, catfish, even a couple of striped bass that do go up and down that slide. Alewife use it too, but we're not seeing as many as we would like. I personally want to see all the dams come down on the river, but I don't have the funds to push that forward by myself. Going down to the very small, we do periodic macroinvertebrate studies with students. And so that's basically taking samples of submerged leaves underwater, shaking them out, and counting little critters that fall out. Usually it's things like snails and worms and freshwater shrimp. But we always find at least one really unusual insect. Most recently, it was a caddisfly. Earlier in the summer, we found a cranefly, and previously we'd found the damselfly. These are all insects that really require reasonably healthy water to actually complete their life cycle and mature to adulthood. You're not going to find them in like really nasty bodies of water with low levels of oxygen and high levels of pollution. So we find them in the Bronx, which is pretty remarkable. It's not really a water body where you'd expect to find sensitive species, but we're finding them. And so at the bare minimum, the river is able to support a handful of those sensitive species, and that gives us hope.
Those are good indications. Hopefully, as you continue to do that, you'll be able to find more of those kind of indicator species that are, indicating that conditions are improving. I know that they've done studies inside the river at NYBG through some of the education programs for high school students and for adults. So I wonder if all these data can kind of be combined. Cornelia has a question. She asked, did you see the piano that was in the river in Bronxville? I assume this was kind of recent.
I did not see it with my own eyes. I saw a picture of it. Yeah, I have no explanation for that. We keep finding things like bicycles and those new scooters, the ride-sharing scooters, where you sort of, you can pay to use an electric scooter and zip around the city. People keep throwing those over the edges of bridges and riverbanks. And it's not just like one or two. We found like 5 at a time in some locations. So I don't really know what drives people to do things like this. I can't really, explain human behavior and human psychology. It's not my strong suit, unfortunately. I don't know how to address that right now. But hopefully, the more we do work like this and the more we do outreach, we'll see behavior changes and we'll see people start to become, embrace stewardship more and more.
I wonder also if the recent, like those big floods that happened recently, how those kind of may have, brought some really large things into the river. But I guess also a question of that is kind of, how can that be avoided? Is there a way that can be avoided, or is a lot of that flooding to do with kind of the city infrastructure and that is kind of as it exists?
Good question. I have to turn to our dear friend Robert Moses to answer that in part. As he straightened the Bronx River to build his parkways and make it easier to develop a lot of the area and get people between New York City and Westchester County and bypass the Bronx. He straightened the river. He got rid of a lot of the soft banks and put in what we call armored boundaries, and so the river is lined with boulders where that would have been soil and trees. And so the river does not have a lot of access to the floodplain the way it used to. Rivers are naturally supposed to meander, right? And that helps them to relieve pressure. We kind of stopped the Bronx River from doing that. And so the flooding is becoming worse and worse. It was catastrophic in Bronxville and East Yonkers from Hurricane Ida. We had testimonials of people whose kitchens were flooded up to their stovetops from that hurricane. And so, there really is no end in sight. And we can build all the green infrastructure that we want to try to absorb some of that water, but, I don't need to be so doom and gloom. We all hear this in the news all the time, but yeah, it really has to do with the way that we've built up this urban landscape that we're reaping these consequences now.
Yeah, it's crazy how some of these, it's an unintended kind of consequence of trying to geoengineer kind of with an incomplete understanding of kind of the system in the first place. And, of course, I guess as, more of these kind of weather events increase, it's only going to become more apparent kind of what effects that has. So, and you have your hand raised. Go ahead. You can ask a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it's a little too complicated for chat, but I'm working with my local community board in Manhattan about ways to reduce CSOs. And we're sort of talking about two different things. We're talking about like the technical solutions, like lowering, like increasing green roofs and bioswales and stuff like that. And also the social things like getting people to adopt a drain, adopt a sewer drain and stuff like that. But just increasing awareness, like don't take a shower when it's pouring, so, and I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for resources that might kind of help us improve what we like, how we can do that.
Yeah, we partner with a lot of organizations in the area. One that comes to mind right now is the Swim Coalition. They're made up of scientists, attorneys. They like to fight the city on different things. They come out to meetings with the DEP and they make a lot of noise when the DEP releases plans that we don't think are going to be very effective. They have a lot of resources on their website, and so I would first and foremost, direct you to the Swim Coalition. Their goal, their mission as an organization is to eventually make all of New York City's waterways swimmable, safe enough for us to actually bathe in and make contact in. And so they're definitely very much invested in this fight.
Great. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
I see Anne had a question. Where do cigarette butts fall in? It's pretty funny. the funny thing about cigarette butts, Anne, is that they are composite materials. And so they are actually partly plastic. The little filter part is made from fibers, which don't break down. And so they actually become sort of unrecognizable as they move through the water system. And they can be miscounted as miscellaneous trash when they really are cigarette butts. And so it kind of points to how difficult some of the aspects of our water quality programming can be.
Speaking of this, I had another interesting comment from Lori about the supposedly biodegradable dog poop bags that will biodegrade, where they really just break down into microplastics. Have you guys seen a lot of that, or do you have any kind of comments about that?
I'll be honest, I actually am not very familiar with biodegradable pet waste bags. We do sometimes just see people who pick up their dog waste, put it in the bag, and then put that bag back on the ground where the waste was, which kind of leaves me a little flabbergasted, because at least pet waste is a natural part of the environment, even though it's gross and messy and potentially hazardous. It's better than a piece of plastic that cannot break down. So I don't really know. I would at least say when we find human sewage, it's not just human waste, but there's also chemicals that are entering the water with that sewage. So really, I don't know that dog waste getting out into the environment is as big of a concern. So like, yeah, if a biodegradable bag is letting that waste back out at some point in time, yeah, that's gross, but maybe not the worst that could possibly happen. And I'd rather that than the plastic staying in the environment for the next 40,000 years.
Overall, I think it's really, before you can kind of talk about like how to fix something, you have to really know what the problem is and the extent of the problem. And that's why all the work that the Alliance does is so important, kind of have that baseline to be able to go talk to, people that can make changes and convince them that they're really, here's hard evidence that there's something going on, and here's, actionable ways we can do something about it. But also informing the public or the, community members that, this is important to that for them too, that they have kind of a stake in it, and showing like if we have this resource, if it was really cleaned up and able, there'd be, all these other kind of recreational and other kind of, services that it can also be used for that people are missing out on. So
yeah, and I'd like to highlight Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who did come out to a paddle and then put it all over her social media, which really drummed up support for our recreation program and just for our work in general. She's also been pretty outspoken for some chemicals like PFAS that we're finding in our waterways. And so that again gives me some optimism that we could have some support even at a federal level, in addition to our state, and local electeds. It's always an uphill fight, but it seems like, things are getting a little bit better, especially with the change in administration. So there's some reason for optimism.
yeah. All right. Well, if anybody's interested to find out more, definitely check out their website. If you're interested in becoming one of the water quality people, or I know, I guess a lot of the events, don't have, we can't really hop into the river in the winter, but in the spring again, see if you want to be able to get in the river. And I can personally attest, it's actually really fun to be able to do that, and meet other people too that are kind of interested in this same kind, hopping in the river and getting, well, you don't get dirty because you have gloves and the waders, but I know there's also lots of different ways to get involved if you would like to.